So, the two most famous saints in the Christian calendar, Peter and Paul, a Jew and a Roman citizen, a fisherman and a bureaucrat. Peter, an apostle who was there right from the very beginning. Paul, who rolled in sometime later and said that he too was an apostle. Paul set out two criteria for being an apostle. Apostle was someone who had seen the risen Christ and then proclaimed Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. That was Paul's definition of an apostle. Peter certainly fills Paul's bill, and so does Paul. He experienced the risen Christ, as you'll remember, on the road to Damascus, and he never ceased to proclaim the message of God's love and God's kingdom on earth. But according to those criteria, Mary Magdalene was the very first apostle. Actually, it was she who first saw the risen Christ. You remember the gardener. And it was she who ran to tell the others, after the others had already hightailed it as fast as they could away from that open tomb. But that glorious story is for another day. Today, Peter and Paul. And we really don't know too much about them. Thanks be to God. Well, it's true. Peter certainly was the quintessential human being. Good old Peter, running around, chopping off ears, witnessing the transfiguration and wanting to stop this amazing, amazing event so that he could build 3 little altars to commemorate it. Peter, the one who said, "I will never deny you," and denied 3 times. Peter, to whom Jesus had given the keys of the kingdom, and then watched while Peter fumbled them and dropped them and tried to pick them up again. And that's the point. Peter picked them up again and again and again and again. He never stopped trying to serve his Lord, his Redeemer, his Master. Now, Paul, first known as Saul, was a Roman bureaucrat dead set against this Jesus person, committed to destroying his followers and obliterating his message, a message that Paul saw to be in direct conflict with Paul's masters, the Roman Empire. And the bright light, the appearance of Jesus Christ, the blindness of being led into Damascus, the total conversion of a Jesus hater into one of the greatest Jesus lovers of all time. Peter and Paul. You could say, as an understatement, that they were not the best of buddies. In fact, they didn't agree about anything at all. Peter knew that Jesus wanted him to lead the Jewish nation to Christ. Paul knew that Jesus wanted him to lead the Gentile nations to Christ. Peter knew he was right. Paul knew that he was right. And all the conversation in the world wasn't going to change that. Does this sound at all familiar to you? It's the book of Acts, written, we think, by the one we call Luke, that tells most of the story. We don't hear much, unfortunately, from the book of Acts. It's really quite exciting reading. Not the sort of thing that you read when you want to go to sleep. You want to get Leviticus for that. In the first part of Acts, Luke focuses on Peter and the role that he played in founding the church. And the climax of that story is when Peter visits Caesarea, where a heavenly vision gives him the courage to break with apostolic custom and to baptize an entire family of pagans without requiring them first to submit to Jewish law. Now, that was one very large thing that Peter did. Then Luke shifts his attention to Paul and details Paul's missionary journeys all over the place, and the story culminates with Paul's arrival in Rome, the heart and soul of the pagan world. So in the book of Acts, Peter and Paul appear to be running a relay. Peter carried the gospel during the first lap and then handed it over to Paul to finish the course. Nice idea. No cigar. If you read Paul's account of all these goings-on in his letter to the Galatians, Paul presents a picture of huge conflict. Paul pitted against Peter and the other leaders of the church at Jerusalem. They despised each other. At one point, the two of them got together, and they did agree to accept each other's ministries. And then, bang-o, Peter appears to renege on this arrangement, and Paul tells him off big time right to his face. Mini-series are made of this stuff. In any event, Paul goes off on his own, isolated because of the fight, a fight in which several of his associates deserted him. Now, Peter's letter to the Galatians is really the only first-hand information that we have about any of this. And so these two apostles, and apostles they certainly were, are frozen in antagonism for all of history. Pretty well-founded tradition tells us that both of them suffered martyrdom in Rome around the year 64. Now, because Paul was a Roman citizen, he was granted the right, so-called, to be beheaded by the sword. This is a right granted to any wayward Roman. Peter, on the other hand, is said to have endured crucifixion upside down on a cross because he did not feel worthy to be crucified as his Lord had been crucified. For centuries, their martyrdom has been commemorated on the same feast day, although there's no real way of knowing when they died at the same time or not. So there you have it. Now, what's all that got to do with the price of cheese in 2014? Why do we celebrate these antagonists, these opponents, these adversaries, these contenders? As I said before, they didn't, either of them, seem to be the sort of candidates for fulfilling God's plan. Peter, too enthusiastic for his own good. Paul, intellectual, proud, imperious, eager for his greatness. You know, I think we all know people like that. Think about it. We all know people who are like Peter and Paul. But the secret here, the great and most wonderful mystery, is that God effected a remarkable transformation in each of these men. God saw into the depths of their heart, just as God sees into the depths of ours. And God's grace, God's own remarkable grace, refashioned these men, sanctified them with the deepest love, and led them, perhaps often by the hand, to become the people who became the very foundation of the church. Well, hot tip, my friends. We're probably not the most likely candidates for an eternity of intimate friendship with God either, but it's offered to us freely, that friendship, that intimacy. Peter and Paul teach us that we are all called to share God's love and goodness along with them, whether we're the quintessential human beings, gregarious idiots, or imperious overlords in our own lives. God's love and goodness rest with us as we are all called to share the love and goodness with every single being that we meet. Think about that. All of us apostles, people who have experienced the risen Christ and told others about that experience. And so today we offer our Eucharist first to the honor and glory of God, and then to Peter and Paul, knowing that God has pledged through Jesus to ensure that we share with both of them the joys of all the saints in glory. Wow. Nothing more to say. All the saints in glory. Thanks be to God.